Spider-Man, the movies versus the comics. If you're a fan of all things Web Slinger, then you've probably noticed that the movies have a lot of creative freedom when it comes to adapting the comics. So let's take a look at a few of those differences. Starting out with none other than Peter's web shooter.
Oh God, I'm so sorry. That's never happened to me before. It's just...
Now, if you're a zoomer like me, then your first exposure to Spider-Man may have been the Sam Raimi Trilogy. Yeah, I know I'm a baby. I said my first Sonic game was Sonic Adventure 2 in one of the past videos and people were freaking out. Anyway, in the Raimi movies, Peter being bit by a radioactive spider not only gave him the strength, agility, and climbing abilities of a spider, but also allowed him to organically produce webbing from his, somewhere in his body. He just does it. In the comics, however, Peter is arguably much smarter as he creates his own web shooters and webbing to further enhance his abilities. Though in defense of the Raimi movies, we may not have had the chance to fully see the capabilities of Peter's brains, as there was a cancelled fourth movie in the works. The next two iterations of Spider-Man by Sony in the MCU, on the other hand, both feature the creation of web shooters, more accurately adapting the source material. Consolation prize for Raimi though is that his organic webbing idea was shortly adapted in the comics, so yet another win for that man. Raimi may have changed the origins of Spider-Man's webs, but the original trilogy was still pretty faithful to Spider-Man's origins of the comics, taking inspiration from the first ever Spider-Man story in Amazing Fantasy number 15. Everything from the wrestling gig where Peter beats Crusher Hogan to Peter letting the thief go, who would later go on to take out his Uncle Ben, was ripped straight from the comics. The only thing Raimi skipped was the part where Peter became a famous TV star during his origin story. And this time it wasn't infamy. After Peter took out Crusher Hogan in the comics, a TV producer approaches him and suggests that he continue his Spider-Man act for live television, in which he's widely successful and gets the 1960s equivalent of 15 minutes of internet fame. Of course, all that fame goes to his head when he arrogantly ignores the thief that would go on to take out his Uncle Ben, stating that he's only there to look out for himself. And you know the rest of the story from here. Raimi probably left out the celebrity bit for the sake of time, but its inclusion in the comics adds that extra layer of character, giving Peter's realization that with great power comes great responsibility, that extra oomph, and his arrogance was just the cherry on top. Peter actually had more gigs after his TV star outing in the comics. If you've only seen the films, his occupations have been limited as a student, photographer, or your friendly neighborhood pizza delivery guy. But the comics have the added benefit of being able to explore Parker in multiple periods of his life outside of high school or immediately after. For example, during the assassination plot storyline from the Amazing Spider-Man run, he's hired as a bodyguard by the Silver Sable and is paid $1,000 per hour. And after his accumulated experience with the Daily Bugle, he was able to land a job as the lead news editor. Oh, and how about this? He was also the CEO of his own major company. But it was only after Doc Ock took over his body and bettered Peter's life, solely to prove that he was superior to someone half his age. That's okay though, because after Peter regained control of his body, he expanded his company called Parker Industries into a global corporation much like Tony Stark. Lastly, one of his more humble professions was his job as a high school science teacher during the Amazing Spider-Man comic series, which many fans agreed was the perfect job for Peter since it allowed for him to explore his love for science further and teach it to the next generation. Unfortunately, as they do, Spider-Man things had to get in the way of all these jobs. So it's a good thing that Peter has a good sense of humor so that he can laugh the pain away of not being able to balance the life he loves and his responsibilities as a superhero. Just kidding, because he's not nearly as funny in the movies. Of course, comedy is subjective, so I'm not here to tell you that one medium is funnier than the other, but there's no argument that the Spider-Man of the comics uses a lot more of those superhero one-liners that annoy the hell out of his enemies. In the comics, Spider-Man is much more quick-witted and rapid-fires jokes during his battles in almost every panel. The Raimi films seem to be the furthest from this in terms of sense of humor, since Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man is known for being the lovable, quiet dude, when he's not Bully Maguire, of course. Sony and the MCU's interpretations are far closer to the comic book counterparts, with both Parkers delivering many more jokes. However, none of the films seem to come close to the truckload of jokes that the comic Spider-Man shoots out per page. Now, more specific to the MCU's iteration of Spider-Man is MJ, who goes by Michelle Jones Watson in the films, and Mary Jane Watson in the comics. Alright, yeah, that's the obvious one, but there are quite a few key differences in how she is portrayed in the MCU. First off, in the comics, MJ is an aspiring actor and model. a stark contrast to her film counterpart who couldn't care less about her appearance. Next is the age difference, as MJ in the comics meets Peter in college and doesn't actually start dating him until well after. In the MCU, they're both still in high school, so neither of their frontal lobes are fully developed. They both still need time to grow into themselves, which may have been the reason for No Way Home's ending. Which also means, personality-wise, MJ in the films is going to be an awkward teenager, as she is portrayed. In the comics, however, since she's older and therefore more socially experienced, her character is much more confident and direct. Down the line, we may see a more complicated relationship between the two like they have in the comics, because they have broken up and gotten back together more times than I can count. But for now, the differences mostly lie in the fact that MJ has much more development we can look forward to. Bonus fact, Peter did actually temporarily have a physical relationship with a character named Michelle Gonzalez. But I'm not here to talk anymore about Peter's love life. No, I'm here to talk about Peter getting bullied, the highlight of his career, and the villain origin story of Bully Maguire. Nah, but seriously, there's so much more to Flash Thompson's character in the comics than what was shown in the films. And again, this is probably because the comics have years upon years of stories on their side, as well as the benefit of not being limited to a 2-hour runtime once every 2 years. You'll see that this is a running theme in this list. Similarly to MJ, Flash isn't as fleshed out in the films because all of the Spider-Man franchises have only explored his origins as a bully in high school and haven't gone much further past that. In the comics, however, Peter and Flash grow pretty close after their high school graduation, and he even goes on to become Agent Venom, a super soldier created by the US government that utilized the Venom symbiote. Now, there is a possibility that in the next trilogy of MCU Spider-Man films, we could see Peter and Flash develop a friendship and finally get a complete version of Flash's character development. Now, Flash wasn't Peter's only bully. I mean, obviously, since Peter is technically bullied by all of his enemies, right? Would the Green Goblin taking out Aunt May in cold blood right in front of him constitute bullying? Let's see here. Yep, sounds like bullying to me. Jonah Jameson also bullied Peter relentlessly and made his life very difficult as both a normal guy and a superhero. The films only portray him as such, but the comics again have the added benefit of years of publication and really could play up the complex relationship between Peter and Jameson and Spider-Man and Jameson. In the comics, Peter worked for the Daily Bugle since he was a teenager and was able to form a pretty close bond with Jameson, something that the movies have not been able to play up and only portrayed him as that angry news editor boss archetype. Eventually, when Jameson finds out that Peter is Spider-Man, that moment is so impactful because of the years upon years of buildup of their relationship. This will probably be something we will never experience in cinematic form, unless Spider-Man is rebooted again somewhere in the far future. Which, let's be honest, will inevitably happen at some point, so you know what, maybe one day. One more important character that was portrayed much differently in the films is Aunt May, who in the MCU has been de-aged just so Happy could be rejected.
So nice to meet you.
Wait, have you been crying?
We broke up.
The comics Aunt May is noticeably older, which the Raimi Trilogy adapted. The trilogy also went out to portray her as a sweet old lady. The MCU, however, adapted Aunt May's strong and confident personality from the comics, while obviously making her much younger. Just to keep touching up on the age point here, in The Amazing Spider-Man, Aunt May is middle-aged instead of elderly, so each iteration of the character in the films has gotten younger. And of course in the MCU, Aunt May takes Uncle Ben's place as the character who teaches Peter the pivotal lesson that with great power comes great responsibility, by being bullied into submission by the Green Goblin. This one is a bit more specific and focuses on the Amazing Spider-Man films, but there is a very subtle difference in the way that Gwen Stacy's father, Captain George Stacy, was portrayed in the films in comparison to the comics. First off, credit where credit's due. The Amazing Spider-Man films were very accurate in terms of everything Gwen Stacy, all the way up to how she passed away, which is still chilling to see on screen. They did not need to add the sound of her hitting her head on the ground, oh my god. Her father's passing scene, however, was much different than in the comics. In the movies, they decided to utilize his passing to foreshadow Gwen's fate, as he tells Peter to leave his daughter alone for her own safety. In the comics, however, Captain Stacy uses his final moments to tell Peter to be good to Gwen and shows his trust in Peter taking care of her, while also revealing he knows his identity as Peter Parker. something that Peter very much likes to keep under wraps in the comics as much as he can. And while the same can be said for the movies, they really like to show Peter without his mask. Now, of course, there's a reason for this. In the films, they need to have the mask off during emotional sections of the story. Otherwise, how will the audience know what the protagonist is feeling other than by hearing his voice? The comics, on the other hand, can keep his mask on in most situations because the nature of the medium provides many more ways to express emotion. In film, we mostly rely on seeing an actor's face to understand what the movie is trying to tell us at any given moment. Despite what the title says, there's a lot more that I didn't have time to touch up on in this video, like that down the line Peter gets married and has kids, which, you know, we might eventually see, but we would love to hear other differences you may have noticed in the films versus the comics. Or you could just roast me about how much I missed, whatever floats your boat. Alright, that's all I got for you guys this time. This is Patrice with Screen Rant, and I'm swinging out.